The evening air was heavy with the calm that only a small town could provide. It was one of those nights where the hum of crickets accompanied the faint rustle of leaves, creating an almost surreal sense of tranquility. Two officers, Jackson and Miller, were patrolling the main street, their squad car idling as they scanned the area for any sign of trouble. Neither expected anything out of the ordinary. Most nights, their biggest catch was a stray jaywalker or a car running a red light. Tonight seemed no different until they spotted an older sedan cruising through the dimly lit road, one taillight flickering like a dying ember. "Looks like we've got one," Jackson muttered, flicking on the patrol lights. The car pulled over immediately, rolling to a stop on the shoulder. Jackson and Miller exchanged a glance, their expressions mirroring an unspoken agreement, standard procedure. Jackson approached the vehicle cautiously while Miller hung back, one hand resting on his utility belt. The driver, a black woman in her mid-40s, rolled down the window, her face calm but unreadable. "Evening, ma'am," Jackson began, his voice firm but polite. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression softening with what could only be described as quiet confidence. "I assume it's the taillight," she replied, her voice steady, betraying neither fear nor irritation. Neither officer could muster a response. They simply nodded, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and dread as they gestured for her to park her car and join them at the side of the road. As she stepped out, her presence seemed to fill the space, and for the first time that evening, Jackson and Miller realized just how much trouble they might be in. Evelyn, however, wasn't there to intimidate or humiliate them. She had a point to make, and this encounter was about to become a lesson neither of them would ever forget. Evelyn stepped out of her car with an air of calm authority that seemed to ripple through the night like a subtle but powerful current. She didn't slam the door or move hastily. Instead, she closed it softly and adjusted her coat, her movements deliberate, almost as if she were giving the officers time to process what had just occurred. Jackson and Miller exchanged wide-eyed glances, each hoping the other would take the lead. "Gentlemen," Evelyn began, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "Why don't we step over here for a moment?" She gestured toward the side of the road, away from her car and their squad vehicle. The officers hesitated briefly, then followed, their usual swagger replaced by a subdued stiffness. The small stretch of gravel beneath their feet crunched with every step, amplifying the awkward silence that hung in the air. Evelyn stopped and turned to face them, her expression unreadable. Jackson cleared his throat, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Miller fidgeted with his belt, glancing around nervously as though searching for an escape route. "Officer Jackson." "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, addressing them by name. She had already glanced at their badges during the stop. "Do you know why I didn't tell you who I was right away?" Neither responded immediately, the question catching them off guard. Jackson finally managed a weak, "No, ma'am." Evelyn nodded, her gaze piercing but not unkind. "It's because I wanted to see how you handled yourselves. To understand how you treat the people you're sworn to protect, especially those you might perceive as different from yourselves." Miller opened his mouth to interject, but Evelyn raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that was more measured than dismissive. "Let me share something with you," she continued. "I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years. I've worked every kind of case you can imagine, from petty theft to homicide. But what I've learned, what I know, is that how we treat people in the little moments matters just as much as how we act in the big ones." Jackson's face flushed, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, Let me finish," Evelyn interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "When you pulled me over, you didn't see a chief of police. You saw a black woman driving an older car. And I could feel the assumptions forming in the way you spoke to me, in the questions you asked. Now, I don't blame you for the taillight. That was legitimate, and you had every right to stop me. But the way you approached the situation, that's where we need to talk." Miller finally found his voice, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We didn't mean anything by it, Chief. We were just doing our job." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I believe you," she said after a moment. But intent isn't the same as impact. You may not have meant anything by it, but how do you think it felt for me, sitting there, knowing who I am and what I represent, and yet being treated as though I were a potential threat or someone who didn't belong? The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on the two officers like a physical force. Jackson looked at the ground, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I'm not here to punish you," Evelyn continued, her voice softening slightly. "I'm here to teach you. Because the truth is, you're not bad cops. I can see that. You're young, you're eager, and you want to do your job well. But if you don't confront the biases you carry, if you don't learn to see people for who they are, not who you assume them to be, you're going to hurt people. And that's not what this badge is for." She let the words sink in before stepping back slightly, giving them room to breathe. Jackson finally looked up, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. "Chief," he said quietly, "you're right. I didn't realize it at the time, but I see it now. And I'm sorry. I can't speak for both of us, but I promise I'll do better." Miller nodded vigorously, his voice cracking slightly as he added, "Me too. I swear, Chief. We didn't mean to disrespect you or anyone else. We weren't thinking." Evelyn regarded them for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. "I believe you," she said. "But believing you isn't enough. Change doesn't come from words, it comes from action. So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you're both going to join me in my office. We're going to go over some new training protocols I've been working on, ones designed to address exactly these kinds of situations. And after that, you're going to help me implement those protocols across the precinct." The officers nodded quickly, their relief palpable. "Yes, ma'am," Jackson said, his voice steady for the first time since the stop began. "Good," Evelyn replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Now, I'm going to let you finish your shift. And I'm going to trust that the next person you pull over, no matter who they are or what they look like, will walk away feeling like they were treated with respect." "Yes, ma'am," both officers said in unison. Evelyn nodded again, her expression softening further. "Drive safely, gentlemen," she said, turning back toward her car. As she drove away, the two officers stood in silence, watching her taillights fade into the distance. It was Miller who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did we just get the lecture of a lifetime?" Jackson let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah," he replied. "And you know what? We deserved it." The two of them climbed back into their squad car, their usual banter replaced by thoughtful silence. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just officers on patrol, they were men re-evaluating the very foundation of their duty. The following morning, Evelyn sat in her office, reviewing the precinct's training manual. The sun poured through the blinds, casting soft streaks of light across her desk as she sipped her coffee. It was early, barely past 6, but she preferred it this way. The quiet hours of the morning gave her space to think and strategize. Today wasn't just another day, it was the start of a much-needed shift in how the precinct operated. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Before she could respond, the door creaked open, and Jackson and Miller stepped in. They looked different from the night before. Gone was the bravado and casual confidence. Instead, they carried themselves with a mix of humility and determination. Their uniforms were crisp, and their expressions were earnest. "Morning, Chief," Jackson said, his tone respectful. "Good morning," Evelyn replied, setting her coffee down. She gestured to the chairs across from her desk. "Take a seat." The officers complied, their movements careful as though they were trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the room. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, studying them for a moment before speaking. "I want to start by saying I appreciate you both coming in early," she began. "It tells me you're willing to learn, and that's the most important step." Miller nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "We are, Chief. We meant what we said last night." We want to do better. Evelyn smiled faintly. Good. Because what we're about to discuss isn't just about you two, it's about the culture of this entire precinct. The way you handled last night's stop wasn't just a reflection of your individual choices, it's a symptom of a larger problem. And if we're going to fix it, we need to address it from the ground up. She slid a folder across the desk toward them. Take a look, she said. Jackson opened the folder, revealing a series of case studies, statistics, and training exercises. Each document highlighted issues related to implicit bias, racial profiling, and community policing. The data was sobering, charts showing disproportionate stops of minority drivers, reports of community mistrust, and testimonials from residents who felt alienated by the very people meant to protect them. Miller's brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. I knew things weren't perfect, but I didn't realize it was this bad, he admitted quietly. Evelyn nodded. A lot of people don't. That's part of the problem. It's easy to ignore something when it doesn't affect you directly. But as officers, it's our job to see beyond our own experiences. To understand the impact our actions have on others, even when we don't mean to cause harm. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. That's why we're implementing a new program. Starting today, every officer in this precinct will undergo enhanced training focused on de-escalation, cultural competency, and implicit bias. And you too, she added, her gaze steady, are going to help me lead it. Jackson's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Us? Yes, Evelyn said firmly. You both made a mistake last night, but you also owned up to it. That willingness to acknowledge your faults and learn from them is exactly what I need from my leaders. This isn't about punishment, it's about growth. And the best way to grow is to take an active role in the solution. Miller looked at Jackson, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Chief, I don't know if we're qualified for something like this, he said hesitantly. You're more qualified than you think, Evelyn replied. The fact that you're uncomfortable right now tells me you're taking this seriously. And that's what matters. Growth doesn't happen in comfort zones, Officer Miller. It happens when we're willing to step into the unknown and challenge ourselves. She leaned forward, her expression softening. Look, I'm not expecting you to have all the answers. That's why we're doing this together. But what I need from you is a commitment to listen, to learn, and to lead by example. Can you do that? Jackson straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening with resolve. Yes, ma'am, he said firmly. Miller nodded, his earlier hesitation replaced by determination. We're in. Evelyn smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. Good. Then let's get to work. The morning passed in a blur of discussions and planning. Evelyn walked the officers through the new training modules, explaining the purpose behind each exercise and how they would be implemented. She shared stories from her own career, moments when she had faced similar challenges, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Her openness seemed to put the officers at ease, and by the time lunch rolled around, they were fully engaged, offering ideas and asking thoughtful questions. But the real test came that afternoon, when Evelyn took them into the field. She had arranged a series of community meetings to gather input from residents about their experiences with the police. The first meeting was held at a local community center, and the room was packed with people from all walks of life. As they entered, Jackson and Miller exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, and it was clear that many in the audience were there to air grievances. Evelyn, however, seemed unfazed. She greeted the crowd with a warm smile and introduced herself and the two officers. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs. We're here today because we want to hear from you. To understand your experiences, your concerns, and your hopes for how we can improve the relationship between this precinct and the community it serves. At first, the responses were guarded. People spoke cautiously, testing the waters to see if Evelyn was genuinely interested in listening or simply going through the motions. But as the conversation progressed, the tone began to shift. Evelyn's genuine engagement and willingness to acknowledge past mistakes seemed to disarm even the most skeptical participants. Jackson and Miller listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. By the end of the meeting, they had a clearer understanding of the challenges they faced, and a renewed sense of purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, an elderly woman approached the officers, her expression thoughtful. "You've got a tough road ahead," she said, her voice tinged with both caution and hope. "But if you're willing to walk it, this town just might surprise you." Jackson nodded, her words resonating deeply. "We're willing," he said simply. Miller smiled, adding, "And we're ready to start." Evelyn watched them with quiet pride. It wasn't going to be easy, but she could see the spark of change in their eyes. And that, she knew, was the first step toward building something better. In the weeks following the community meeting, Evelyn's precinct became a flurry of activity. The new training program rolled out in phases, each meticulously designed to challenge the officers' perspectives while equipping them with practical tools for change. Evelyn worked tirelessly, pouring her energy into every detail, knowing that the success of the program hinged on the buy-in from her team. Jackson and Miller became central figures in this transformation, their initial uncertainty giving way to a growing sense of responsibility. Evelyn had tasked them with leading several workshops, and though they'd approached the first few with hesitation, they quickly found their footing. The workshops were interactive and thought-provoking, combining role-playing scenarios, open discussions, and case studies. During one session, Evelyn introduced a particularly powerful exercise. Each officer was paired with a community member who shared a story about a negative encounter with law enforcement. The officers were instructed to listen without interrupting, then reflect on how the interaction could have been handled differently. The room was heavy with emotion as people recounted their experiences, stories of fear, humiliation, and mistrust. Jackson found himself paired with a young man named Andre, who described a harrowing encounter from his teenage years. "I was walking home from a basketball game," Andre began, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, but a cop stopped me anyway. He said I fit the description. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground, handcuffed, while my neighbors watch. They let me go eventually, but they never apologized. Do you know what that does to a person? To be treated like a criminal when all you're doing is existing?" Jackson's chest tightened as he listened. He could see the hurt in Andre's eyes, and it dawned on him that this wasn't just a story, this was a wound that had never fully healed. When it was his turn to respond, Jackson spoke carefully. "I can't undo what happened to you," he said, his voice low. "But I can promise you that I'm working to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Andre studied him for a long moment before nodding. "That's all I want," he said simply. Across the room, Miller was having a similar experience. His partner, an older woman named Mrs. Rivera, shared how she had once called the police for help during a domestic dispute, only to feel dismissed and ignored. "They treated me like I was the problem," she said, her hands wringing nervously. "Like I was wasting their time. I never called again after that. Even when things got bad, I just dealt with it on my own." Miller felt a lump rise in his throat as he listened. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserved better than that. And it's our job to make sure you feel safe enough to call us when you need help." The exercise was transformative, leaving a lasting impression on both the officers and the community members involved. By the end of the session, there was a palpable sense of progress, a feeling that, while trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, the foundation was being laid brick by brick. Evelyn watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. This was exactly what she had envisioned when she'd taken on the role of chief, a precinct that wasn't just reactive but proactive, one that prioritized connection over control. But not everyone was on board with the changes. A small but vocal group of officers resisted the new protocols, grumbling about political correctness and coddling the public. Evelyn addressed their concerns head-on during a staff meeting, her tone firm but fair. "This isn't about politics," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about integrity. It's about doing our jobs in a way that honors the badge we wear. If you think this is about coddling anyone, then you've misunderstood the very essence of policing. Our job isn't to dominate, it's to serve. And if you're not willing to embrace that, then maybe this isn't the place for you. Her words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge her. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Evelyn knew it would take time to win them over, but she was prepared for the long haul. As the program continued, the precinct began to see tangible results. Complaints about officer conduct dropped significantly, and community engagement events were met with increasing enthusiasm. Evelyn's approach wasn't just changing the way her officers operated, it was changing the way the community perceived them. One day, Evelyn received a call from the mayor, who had heard about the precinct's progress. "Chief Monroe," he said, his tone warm, "I wanted to congratulate you on the work you're doing. I've been hearing a lot of positive feedback from the community. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." "Thank you, Mayor," Evelyn replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go." The call was a small victory, but it reaffirmed Evelyn's belief that change was possible, even in the face of resistance. One evening, after a particularly long day, Evelyn found herself back in her office, reflecting on the journey so far. A knock at the door startled her, and she looked up to see Jackson and Miller standing there, looking slightly sheepish. "Got a minute, Chief?" Jackson asked. "Always," Evelyn replied, gesturing for them to come in. The two officers exchanged a glance before Jackson spoke. "We just wanted to thank you," he said, "for giving us a chance to be part of this. I think I speak for both of us when I say it's changed the way we see this job, and ourselves." Miller nodded. "Yeah. It's not easy, but it feels right. Like we're actually making a difference." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You are," she said. "And I couldn't be prouder of the both of you." As they left, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace washing over her. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for the precinct and the community. The precinct was unrecognizable a few months after Evelyn had initiated her transformation program. The building itself hadn't changed much, its beige walls and scuffed floors still spoke of decades of wear, but the atmosphere was different. There was a buzz of energy and purpose that hadn't existed before, a sense that everyone was working towards something bigger than themselves. Evelyn could feel it as she walked the halls, her heels clicking against the tiles. Officers greeted her with genuine smiles, their interactions with one another more collaborative than competitive. Even the community had started to notice. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid the precinct now stopped by to chat or participate in community events. The momentum was undeniable, but Evelyn knew that change was fragile. It needed constant tending, especially in the face of inevitable setbacks. One such setback came on a brisk Friday afternoon. Evelyn was in her office, reviewing the latest crime statistics, when her phone buzzed with a text from Officer Sanchez, one of her more enthusiastic recruits. The message was short but alarming. "Chief, we've got a situation. You might want to come to the station." Evelyn grabbed her coat and hurried downstairs. The station's lobby was packed with people, their voices a chaotic blend of anger and frustration. At the center of the commotion stood Jackson and Miller, their faces pale and tense as they tried to calm the crowd. "What's going on?" Evelyn asked, stepping into the fray. Jackson turned to her, relief flashing across his face. "There was an incident at a traffic stop," he explained quickly. "One of our officers pulled over a local teacher, Mrs. Green, for a busted taillight. She says he escalated the situation unnecessarily, and now the community's here demanding answers." Evelyn's stomach tightened. This was exactly the kind of situation they had been working to prevent. She raised her hands, calling for quiet. "Everyone, please," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I understand you're upset, and I promise we'll address this. But shouting over one another won't solve anything. Let's take this one step at a time." The crowd began to settle, though tension still hung heavy in the air. Evelyn turned to Mrs. Green, who stood near the front, clutching a folder of papers. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly. "Mrs. Green," Evelyn said gently, "why don't we step into my office and talk this through?" Mrs. Green hesitated but eventually nodded, following Evelyn upstairs. Once inside, she sat stiffly in the chair across from Evelyn's desk, her fingers gripping the edges of her folder. "Tell me what happened," Evelyn said, her tone steady. Mrs. Green took a deep breath, then launched into her story. She explained how she'd been driving home from school when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She had pulled over immediately, but the officer, someone Evelyn didn't recognize by name, had approached her car with his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "He treated me like a criminal," Mrs. Green said, her voice cracking. "I kept telling him I was on my way home from work, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept asking me if I had anything in the car he should know about. My students' papers were in the back seat, for goodness sake." Evelyn listened intently, jotting down notes as Mrs. Green spoke. When she finished, Evelyn leaned forward, her expression sincere. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said. "That's not how we want our officers to interact with the community. I promise you, we'll look into this immediately." Mrs. Green nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just want to feel safe, Chief Monroe. That's all." "You have every right to feel that way," Evelyn said. After Mrs. Green left, Evelyn called an emergency meeting with her leadership team. Jackson and Miller were among the first to arrive, their expressions a mix of anger and frustration. "This shouldn't have happened," Jackson said as he sat down. "We've been working so hard to rebuild trust, and now this." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "And that's why we need to handle this the right way. We're not sweeping this under the rug. Transparency is key." The team reviewed the body camera footage from the incident, which confirmed much of Mrs. Green's account. The officer in question had been unnecessarily confrontational, his tone and posture escalating the interaction rather than defusing it. Evelyn's chest tightened as she watched. This was exactly the kind of behavior her training program was designed to eliminate. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan. Evelyn would hold a press conference to address the incident, and the officer involved would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. They would also invite Mrs. Green back to discuss how the precinct could make amends. The press conference was held the following morning, drawing a large crowd of reporters and community members. Evelyn stood at the podium, her uniform crisp and her expression resolute. "Yesterday, an incident occurred that fell short of the standards we've set for this precinct," she began. "I want to start by apologizing to Mrs. Green and the community for what happened. We are committed to accountability and transparency, and we will take every necessary step to ensure incidents like this do not happen again." Her words were met with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. But as the days passed and the precinct followed through on its promises, meeting with Mrs. Green, disciplining the officer involved, and doubling down on training efforts, the tide began to turn. Evelyn knew the road to trust was long and fraught with obstacles, but she also knew they were making progress. One evening, as she was locking up her office, she received a text from Mrs. Green, "Thank you for listening and taking action. It means more than you know." Evelyn smiled, a sense of quiet pride filling her chest. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And as she looked out at the precinct she had worked so hard to transform, she felt hopeful, not just for her team, but for the community they served. The precinct was beginning to feel the ripple effects of Evelyn's unwavering commitment to transformation. Weeks after the incident with Mrs. Green, the atmosphere in the community remained tense, but it was no longer hostile. Conversations were happening, difficult, emotional, but necessary ones. Evelyn knew these were the first signs of a deeper healing process, one that required constant nurturing. The precinct's public outreach programs began to draw more attention. Evelyn implemented a new initiative called Walk in My Shoes, where officers would spend a day shadowing community members in their workplaces or homes. It was a bold and unconventional idea, but Evelyn believed it was essential for fostering empathy and breaking down barriers. Officer Jackson was paired with a mechanic named Terrence, who owned a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. Terrence had been skeptical of the program at first, but as Jackson rolled up his sleeves and got to work, the ice began to thaw. Together, they replaced a carburetor, balanced tires, and even shared stories about their childhoods over greasy sandwiches in the back office. By the end of the day, Terrence had a newfound respect for Jackson, and Jackson walked away with a deeper understanding of the struggles faced by small business owners. "It's easy to judge people when you don't know their story," Jackson admitted during the program's debrief. "This program is teaching me to look at everyone with fresh eyes." Miller, meanwhile, spent his day with a single mother named Keisha, who juggled 2 jobs while raising 3 young children. He followed her to her early morning shift at the diner, then helped her wrangle her kids through homework and dinner prep. By the time the day ended, Miller was exhausted but deeply moved. "I don't know how you do it," he told Keisha, shaking his head. "You're a superhero in my book." Keisha laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. "You're not so bad yourself, Officer Miller," she said. "It's nice to know someone out there actually cares." The program's success exceeded Evelyn's expectations, with officers returning to the precinct with renewed purpose and community members expressing gratitude for being seen and heard. The initiative even caught the attention of local media, and a news crew came to document one of the pairings. Evelyn saw this as an opportunity to showcase the precinct's progress while reinforcing the message that change was possible when people worked together. But as the precinct gained recognition, Evelyn found herself facing an unexpected challenge. A coalition of officers from neighboring precincts began to voice their disapproval, accusing Evelyn of undermining traditional policing methods. Some even accused her of pandering to the community at the expense of officer safety. Evelyn received an invitation to speak at a regional law enforcement summit, where she knew she would have to defend her approach in front of a room full of skeptics. The thought was daunting, but Evelyn saw it as a chance to advocate for a new vision of policing, one rooted in respect, empathy, and accountability. The day of the summit arrived, and Evelyn took the stage to a mix of polite applause and wary silence. She began her presentation with a story about her father, a former police officer who had always told her that the badge was a symbol of trust, not power. "My father believed that being a police officer wasn't just a job, it was a calling," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "He taught me that our greatest weapon isn't a gun or a badge. It's our ability to connect with people, to understand their struggles, and show them that we're here to help, not harm." She shared the success stories from her precinct, the community events, the training programs, the lives changed by initiatives like Walk in My Shoes. She also addressed the setbacks, acknowledging that the journey had been anything but smooth. "But here's the truth," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. It forces us to confront our own biases and mistakes. But if we want to build trust, real, lasting trust, we have to be willing to put in the work. Because without trust, we can't do our jobs effectively. And without the community's support, we're just another group of people with badges and guns." The room was silent as she finished, her words hanging in the air. Slowly, a few hands began to clap. Then more. By the end, the room erupted into applause, and Evelyn felt a surge of relief and pride. After the summit, several precincts reached out to learn more about Evelyn's programs, and a few even expressed interest in adopting similar initiatives. It was a small but significant victory, a sign that her efforts were beginning to create a ripple effect beyond her own community. Back at the precinct, life continued at its usual frenetic pace. Evelyn juggled meetings, training sessions, and community events, often working late into the night. But she didn't mind, she thrived on the energy and purpose of her work. One evening, as she was leaving the precinct, she noticed a familiar face waiting by the door. It was Mrs. Green, the teacher whose traffic stop had sparked so much upheaval. "Mrs. Green," Evelyn said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I just wanted to say thank you," Mrs. Green replied, smiling warmly. "For everything. I see the changes you're making, and I wanted you to know they're making a difference." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. "That means more than you know," she said. As Mrs. Green walked away, Evelyn stood for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over her. She thought about her journey, the challenges, the triumphs, the people who had inspired her to keep going even when the odds felt insurmountable. She knew there was still much work to be done. Trust wasn't something that could be built overnight, and the road ahead would undoubtedly have its share of obstacles. But Evelyn also knew that she wasn't alone. She had a team of dedicated officers, a community willing to engage, and a vision that was bigger than any one person. As she locked the precinct doors and walked to her car, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just leading a precinct, she was leading a movement. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for her team or her community, but for the future of policing itself.